This is The Writing Game, and I'm Gregory Palaci. Games are a series of loops. Life and death are a loop. Time may, in fact, be a flat circle, which is just another way of describing a loop. Repetition is the essence of our day, our entertainment, and our stories. Repetition is essential to establishing believable characters, ones we can expect to always act the same way. But repetition isn't growth. I think it's very important to have a feedback loop where you're constantly thinking about what you've done and how you could be doing better. Elon Musk. Have you ever wondered what it is about Batman, Spider-Man, or other superheroes that keeps people coming back? Or for that matter, why Sherlock Holmes is still interesting after all these years? Different writers may have their takes on those characters, but by and large, while the aesthetics may change, the characters still act the same. It's a frustrating aspect of series when you, as a reader, viewer, player, want to have a story where things change, as I often do. But it's an aspect of writing that enables series to continue for years, or decades in some cases. Just look at The Simpsons. Little has changed in the intervening years since the show's creation, and it shows in its outdated stereotypes and jokes. Yes, occasionally a character may die or get married. That's rare though. I've by no means watched the entirety of the show, but I know from my random viewings that things are much the same as they ever were. Before we can talk about breaking the loop, we need to talk about what the loop is. In game terms, the loop is a series of actions the player can take. For stories, the loop is how the characters behave. By behavior, I mean what the reader, viewer, or player can expect a character to do given a certain situation. The most iconic characters across media will always do the same thing. Not as one another, but as they've done in previous iterations. Ellen Ripley will warn people, then try to work as a team, before having to do it all herself to save the day. Veronica Mars will crack wise, go undercover, and ferret out the truth. Velma from Scooby-Doo will say jinkies every time she finds a clue, plot out the best way to catch the criminal, and generally be the only person in the mystery machine with any sense, both fashion and common. In comic books, we know Batman has a plan. Superman will do everything he can. Wolverine will get violent. In video games, it gets a bit more complicated, mainly because we have mechanics and gameplay loops to be concerned with, and how they reflect upon the character. Some games, like those of the Halo series, have the gameplay loop and mechanics closely tied to what the character would do. In the Master Chief's case, that's kill with all the firepower he can bring to bear. He's a man of few words, but lots of actions. So the cutscenes are the times when the least amount actually happening. It's why the game, at least to me, feels cohesive, and actions are never out of character for the Master Chief. Other games, like those of the Uncharted series, are commonly criticized for the absurd body count players rack up, when they are ostensibly rogues and explorers, more Indiana Jones or Han Solo than trained soldiers. But even Uncharted and its creators know at times you have to break the loop. That's why they give you the opportunity to stop and explore the Tibetan village in Uncharted 2, should you want to. Otherwise, you can run through the place and get on with your adventure in 2 minutes. But that break, whether for 2 minutes or 20, is one that takes the player and the character out of the loop. There's no combat, there's no climbing or sneaking, and there's no puzzles to solve. It's a world that lets one walk around and explore in peace. It's a walking simulator before there were walking simulators. But that peace is something a lot of games rarely give you. That's why it's so interesting to see a AAA game like Assassin's Creed Origins provide a mode where combat is not the purpose. Sadly, you can't play the game in this mode, merely explore the world, and that's why they call it Discover Mode, or something like that. The change of pace is no different from varying the outcomes of different sections of your story, as I mentioned in the episode Try Fail Cycles. Some games work change of pace into their loops. The Wolfenstein series from Machine Games is a great example. It goes from bombastic combat to quiet stealth sections, to heart-touching moments of tenderness as you converse with other characters. It can cause whiplash in how quickly it jumps from one style to the next, but it can never be accused of being boring. Unless you think killing Nazis is boring, and then you have to question, what's wrong with you? They're Nazis. They're meant to be killed. Yet even with all of that, the issue remains. BJ Blazkowicz doesn't change in any meaningful way as a character. Yes, at the beginning of Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, he's going to be a dad, and trying to come to terms with that means in a world ridden by conflict. But he as a character never ceases to fight, though. That's one of my major issues with game narratives. The characters never seek a different method of solving their problems, and it may be the antithesis of what a game is meant to be. After all, designing systems is difficult, and making them interesting is even more so. But time and again, there seems to be little interest or thought put into the context of those systems and what they mean. People are designing for a feeling, but never exploring a feeling to its fullest extent. Take happiness, for example. You can't, nor should you be, happy all the time. Otherwise, you lose all context for what happiness is. Your baseline flattens out, and that provides you no joy. Experiencing other emotions in relation to happiness showcases all the possible ways one can be happy. You never experience the bittersweet happiness of someone else's success if there isn't a bit of loss for you in that event. Games are so often afraid of testing out more complex emotions or scenarios beyond the bog standard. It's why jump scares are so readily relied upon in horror games, or bullet sponges are so predominant in any form of shooters. Not all games, though. My favorite game to talk about, Firewatch, is one such game that explores complex emotions of love, longing, self-incrimination, and more. The Last of Us also seeks to explore what it means to be a parent and the sacrifices that comes with that. Parenting to some may not seem like an emotion, but as an experience, it's multitudinous in the feelings it evokes. You experience frustration, joy, rage, delight, despair, and everything else, not to mention bone weariness. It's in part why, as game developers have aged, they've started to explore parenthood more, in particular fatherhood, given the vast majority of game developers are male, or male identified. For games that truly explore a range of emotions, you need look no further than interactive fiction. It doesn't matter what the engine is: Ink, Twine, ChoiceScript, Ren'Py, Inform, or TADS. The limited mechanics in those games requires a greater emphasis on the story and the writing. But for those of us writing in more mainstream forms of games, what can we do? Break the loop. Rather, break the line. By line, I mean the standard trajectory of the gameplay loop. The easiest way to do this is with another character. If the main protagonist isn't going to evolve in terms of what they're capable of, then it turns to others to get things done in a different manner. Soldiers have very particular roles, especially in games with class systems. Add that class system or a limited version of it to the campaign, and there's only so much that can be done. That's why games like Call of Duty World War II have levels where you play as the French Resistance. Switching characters gives the player new skills, mechanics, systems, and motivations. For writers, it means we can push against the loop we find ourselves in with the main protagonist. It's also a simple narrative justification for why, in a short period, characters and the player, as a result, are taking different actions or even in different locations. Good antagonists are often mirrors of the protagonist and heroes in their own stories. But there are times when a story is not about contesting with the will of another person, but something else. An organization, an act of God, a force of nature, or some malevolent, inhuman force, or bureaucracy. In those cases, you need another character to act as the mirror. Sidekicks, rivals, love interests, or other player characters are all an opportunity to mirror the central hero and explore the themes their actions, philosophies, and ideas present. They can question everything we as players have done previously and do now. They can straight up call out another character for their choices. Take GLaDOS, for example. They start as a supposed teacher, move on to antagonist, and eventually become ally over the game's Portal and Portal 2. Aside from their actively antagonistic attitude and attempts to kill you, they get to mock you for your choices, such as jumping rather than speaking. But we don't get to play as GLaDOS, and if we have the sound off and no subtitles on, the game wouldn't have had them as a character. Their actions are never explicit given their inability to move, their lack of a body, but they do affect the environment. Delilah in Firewatch is another character that's similar, who acts as a mirror to Henry, but one we never see. So her actions in the world are limited. Even at a distance, she can question us. Questioning the player isn't the sole purpose of other characters, but it is vital to storytelling, to creating drama. It's necessary to get them to change their tactics and approach situations in a different manner. Of course, creating another character isn't always possible due to the constraints of game development. Time, money, energy, people, resources, etc. So, what can we do with just writing if we can't add a new character or expect different mechanics to manifest themselves? Keep it simple. I'll go into this in greater detail in a future episode on that very topic. But for now, it's a matter of keeping your story simple. That's not to say there shouldn't be any consequences to the player choice, a complex narrative structure, or try-fail cycles. Rather, it's a matter of taking a look at the arc the protagonist is meant to take. They needn't change drastically to break the loop, only grow in some way. That growth can be through experiencing new feelings, changing of opinion, changing relationships to others, or expectations of something else being the result of their actions. If this idea seems hard, take a look at the show Rick and Morty. Dan Harmon's entire process for writing is about implementing change in his characters. It can be gradual, but over the series, there's growth. The same is true for his previous show, Community. All of the characters evolved in some ways every episode. Not everything about them has to evolve, but parts of them do. They become more multifaceted as we view them, or in games terms, as we play them. It's gradual so that we can accept that change as viewers or players. That change also allows for new, interesting scenarios to occur that can still make use of the gameplay loop. What is a sitcom other than a game where the characters are tasked with a new scenario every week? It's a game the writers have to play. Let's take these 6 people, put them in an apartment, and tell a new story. That's the game. But they also have to make it interesting and not do the same jokes as before. So, in the case of Community or Rick and Morty, the cast just so happens to use the same techniques as always, but in different ways and to different ends. Rick sciences his way out of problems, and Jeff Winger talks his way out. but there's always a new problem around the corner. More on new problems and Dan Harmon's method of writing the story circle in a future episode. For now, just think about all the small things about your characters that could change, things that don't necessarily impact the gameplay loop. For example, they may become less chatty as the game goes on and the reality of what they face and the choices they must make start to weigh on them. The choice at the end of Far Cry 5, spoilers, whether to betray your allies or take out the big bad, is not one of those hefty, thought-provoking times. But that's down to the execution and ultimate consequences. The game doesn't earn those endings because it never seeks to question the player's actions in any meaningful way beyond having the villain monologue at you. Breaking the loop can also be about making a character choose an option that previously had been against the moral code, be it torture, killing everyone unprovoked, etc. Of course, it doesn't have to be so violent, but it can be a line the player themselves may struggle with. What that is will always depend upon the genre of your story and game. The simplest thing you can do in writing is have the characters of the game analyze what they've done before. Create an internal feedback loop to the story that takes into account what's happened before and the choices the player has made, however small they may be. Even linear, fully authored content can have such a loop. It's just a matter of the characters being cognizant of their actions. That can be done by doubting themselves, being called into question by other characters, having to pay a price they weren't prepared to in order to complete a task, or in any number of other ways. How it happens is really no different than what makes us change in life and get out of our own funk. Things don't go the way we expect, or someone else remarks upon our situation. It's all up to you, the writer. Thanks for taking part in this episode of The Writing Game. I'm Gregory Palaci. Everything I do can be found at onegamedad.com, and I can be reached there or on Twitter at onegamedad.com if you want to talk about writing, games, this show, or even working together. The Writing Game is hosted by Third Culture Kids, which can be found at thirdculturekids.net. Please be sure to like and subscribe or rate and review this show on whatever platform you find it. I'll see you on the next episode.